Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're embarking on a truly massive journey through nearly 3 millennia of history. We all face big setbacks in our own lives, right? But what happens when an entire civilization is leveled to the ground? Usually, when we think of Rome, we picture those enduring monuments, the sprawling empires, and of course, that famous title it proudly wears, the Eternal City. But what if I told you that Rome's identity isn't actually defined by its longevity? No, it's defined by its spectacular, often devastating collapses and its incredibly stubborn rebirths. From mythical origins to the modern metropolis we see today, Rome is a city that has been repeatedly broken, only to be built back anew. Let's get into it.
Here's our agenda for today's deep dive. First, the rise of Rome, then the mighty Roman Empire, followed by why ancient Rome fell. After that, we'll cover the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, the dramatic fall of 1849, and finally, the eternal modern city.
All right, Chapter 1, The Rise of Rome, from Myth to Republic.
So Rome didn't just pop up as an empire overnight. It actually started with a myth. Back in 753 BC, legend has it that the city was founded by Romulus, the famous story of the twin babies suckled by a she-wolf. But the sheer speed of Rome's political evolution is what's truly staggering here. Fast forward just a couple of centuries to 509 BC, and the Romans are overthrowing their kings, replacing the monarchy with the Roman Republic, complete with elected magistrates and a senate. Pretty advanced, right? Then, by 146 BC, Rome had systematically crushed its greatest rival, Carthage, achieving unmatched dominance over the Mediterranean. And finally, that republic gives way to an unprecedented empire in 27 BC when Octavian, who we later know as Augustus, emerges victorious from civil war. It was a brutal but brilliant beginning to imperial rule.
Moving right along to Chapter 2, the mighty Roman Empire, the height of power.
2 million people. Just wrap your head around that number for a second. That was Rome's estimated peak population during the imperial era, making it the largest city in the entire world at the time. This is the Rome of popular imagination, right? Gladiators, massive crowds, all of it. But here is the really fascinating catch. This huge population was heavily subsidized. Roughly 15 to 25% of Rome's entire grain supply was just outright paid for by the central government. The city's sheer scale was sustained almost entirely by immense imperial wealth extracted from conquered territories and the forced labor of enslaved peoples. Without those external subsidies and constant conquest, a city this massive simply could not exist in the ancient world. It was basically an economic miracle teetering on a razor's edge.
Which brings us to Chapter 3, why ancient Rome fell, looking at 8 compounding crises.
Empires often begin to rot right at their borders. Overexpansion created an absolute logistical nightmare for Rome. Think about it, the empire stretched all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Euphrates River. Defending that much land is incredibly difficult and wildly expensive. And at the exact same time, you have the terrifying arrival of the Huns in Europe, which drove Germanic tribes right to Rome's doorstep. Roman officials brutally mistreated these refugees like the Goths, who eventually, and unsurprisingly, turned their weapons against the empire. This whole powder keg culminated in the devastating sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 and again by the Vandals in 455. Meanwhile, because they couldn't recruit enough of their own citizens, the Roman army became heavily reliant on foreign mercenaries. And guess what? Those mercenaries had absolutely zero loyalty to the emperor.
But the threats weren't just outside the walls. The true rot was happening from within. Once expansion finally halted, the empire faced a severe labor deficit, meaning that steady influx of enslaved labor completely dried up. The wealth gap widened astronomically. Politically, the whole empire fractured in two. You had the Greek-speaking Eastern Empire growing incredibly wealthy over in Constantinople, while the Latin-speaking West just descended into chaos. Leadership was, violently unstable. The Praetorian Guard essentially assassinated and installed emperors at will. It was like a revolving door of rulers. And finally, a massive cultural shift brought on by the spread of Christianity displaced the traditional Roman civic religion. That old religion had focused fiercely on the military glory of the state and the divine status of the emperor. So when that vanished, the very glue holding Roman society together basically dissolved.
On to Chapter 4, Middle Ages to Renaissance, a city in ruins.
Now, I want you to imagine a thriving metropolis of millions completely emptying out, because that's exactly what happened. Following the official collapse of the Western Empire in 476 AD and the absolutely devastating Gothic Wars of the 6th century, Rome's population plummeted. It dropped to a mere 30,000 inhabitants. It is a terrifying collapse of civilization. Those grand, famous aqueducts, intentionally cut by invaders and left completely unrepaired. Vast sections of the city literally turned into malaria-infested marshes. Rome basically became a near-abandoned swamp, where the few remaining citizens actually stripped ancient marble and burned priceless centuries-old statues just to make lime for basic survival. Talk about a fall from grace.
But, as they say, nature abhors a vacuum, and so does power. As imperial authority completely vanished, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, stepped in to fill that massive void. This formalizes what we know as the Papal States. Slowly, painstakingly, over several centuries, the popes initiated a massive rebuilding effort. They physically transformed the ancient ruins, often literally building brand new churches directly on top of old pagan temples. This long, arduous recovery eventually set the stage for a new era of incredible artistic splendor during the Renaissance. Though, honestly, even then Rome's cycle of tragedy wasn't totally over. It still had to face further devastation, like the brutal sack by mutinous troops in 1527.
That brings us to Chapter 5, the fall of 1849, the brief Republican resurrection. Let's fast forward to 1849. Now Rome faces a true David and Goliath scenario. A new Roman Republic is declared, which actually forces the Pope into exile and brings the armies of Europe right back to Rome's ancient walls. On one side, you have Pope Pius IX calling upon Catholic European powers. This results in a heavily armed coalition featuring 30,000 highly trained French troops, backed up by Spanish, Austrian, and Sicilian forces. It's a massive army. On the other side stood the newly declared Republic, defended by a much smaller yet fiercely dedicated volunteer force of about 14,000 to 19,000 men. These underdog defenders were guided intellectually by Giuseppe Mazzini and led on the battlefield by the absolutely legendary Giuseppe Garibaldi.
The pressure from the French military was absolute. General Charles Oudinot delivered this terrifying ultimatum directly to the inhabitants of Rome, basically threatening complete destruction if they didn't surrender immediately to papal authority. But, incredibly, the Roman Constituent Assembly unanimously and defiantly rejected it. Knowing full well they were outgunned and outmanned, they looked at the odds and chose to stand and fight for their fledgling democracy anyway.
The resulting siege was brutal and calculated. Early in the morning on June 3rd, the French launched a surprise assault to capture key villas on the Janiculum Hill. Despite Garibaldi's heroic counterattacks, his volunteers were literally charging bayonet first into devastating musket fire. The French were simply too strong. They systematically constructed trench systems to safely advance their heavy cannons, and then began a relentless artillery bombardment that just pounded civilian neighborhoods in Trastevere and permanently damaged historic monuments. Finally, after a bloody, desperate, hand-to-hand final assault on Villa Spada at the end of June, Garibaldi and the Assembly realized resistance was futile. The Republic surrendered on July 1st. It ended a brief but incredibly intense democratic experiment.
In our final chapter, number 6, the eternal modern city, legacy and resilience.
But Rome's story never truly ends, does it? After the French occupation of 1849, the eventual unification of Italy in 1870, and even surviving the harrowing bombings of World War II, Rome reclaimed its status on the world stage. If you visit today, you're walking through a massive, bustling capital of the modern Italian Republic. It's home to a metropolitan population of over 4.4 million people. It is a vibrant, global city that wears its deep scars and its monumental triumphs side by side.
So, we've seen Rome as an empire of millions, a ruined swamp, a papal stronghold, and a modern metropolis. From the barbarian sacks of 410 AD to the French artillery of 1849, this place has been crushed repeatedly. So I leave you to consider this. How does a city that has been conquered, depopulated, and besieged so many times continue to reinvent itself? What is that invisible mortar holding these ancient bricks together? Rome stands today not just as a collection of ruins, but as the ultimate testament to human resilience. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the history around you, and I'll catch you next time.